It all started when I decided my driveway was the perfect spot to install something bold, something no other house in Maplewood had, so I built a fully functional giant clock directly into the concrete, a massive circle of numbers painted right onto the driveway surface with an enormous pair of rotating hands powered by a repurposed motor from an old ceiling fan. Less than 24 hours after the clock made its grand debut, Carol, our iron-fisted HOA president and self-declared curator of community taste, stood on my porch holding a printed violation notice in one hand and a stopwatch in the other, as though she had been timing how long it would take me to break a rule. According to Carol, my clock violated at least 8 separate HOA regulations, including unauthorized driveway alterations, installation of a timekeeping device exceeding approved aesthetic standards, creation of a non-conforming public display, and, most confusingly, potential temporal disruption of neighborhood uniformity. I tried to explain it was just a decorative clock meant to bring some personality to an otherwise boring stretch of concrete, but Carol's eyes glazed over like I had installed a helipad or a roller coaster, and she informed me that if the clock was not removed within 72 hours, I would face escalating fines, forced removal, and potential legal action for public nuisance. That was the moment I knew the clock was not coming down. In fact, the moment Carol called it a public nuisance, the clock became my personal masterpiece, and I decided it would not only stay but it would grow. I upgraded the hands to thick metal rods salvaged from an old trampoline frame, installed solar-powered lights along the edges so it glowed at night, and even built a small raised platform next to it where people could stand to take photos, labeling it the Maplewood Time Traveler Station. Within days, the neighbors started gathering around the clock every evening, using it to time races between their kids on bikes, taking goofy family photos pretending to hold up the minute hand, and treating my driveway like it was some sort of suburban town square. Carol, of course, returned immediately, snapping photos like a crime scene investigator and ranting about visual pollution, unauthorized time-based structures, and something about turning private property into a public spectacle, which frankly sounded like a compliment. By the end of the week, Carol had sent me 6 separate citations, each one more dramatic than the last: illegal installation of industrial equipment, unauthorized community gathering point, violation of quiet enjoyment, despite the fact the clock made no sound, unapproved lighting, and the truly incredible accusation of disrupting the neighborhood's sense of temporal serenity. I responded by hosting the first annual Maplewood Time Games, a community event where neighbors competed in silly time challenges using the clock, from egg and spoon races to synchronized lawn chair dancing, and Carol stood at the edge of my driveway glaring at everyone like a disapproving gargoyle. By now, the clock was no longer just mine. It belonged to the entire neighborhood, and people started using it for everything from neighborhood bake sales to unofficial garage sale countdowns. Carol, desperate to shut it down, called an emergency HOA meeting, where she dramatically unveiled a PowerPoint presentation titled The Threat of the Clock, complete with grainy surveillance photos, exaggerated property value charts, and a timeline she claimed illustrated the moral decline triggered by my driveway's descent into time-based anarchy. Several neighbors openly laughed during her presentation, which only made Carol angrier, and when the meeting opened for comments, resident after resident stood up to defend the clock, calling it the best thing to ever happen to the neighborhood since the annual chili cook-off. One elderly neighbor gave a tearful speech about how the clock gave him something to look forward to every morning, reminding him to take his walk at the same time every day, and how the community gatherings around the clock made him feel connected in a way he never had before. Carol's hands shook with fury as she read the official motion to force the clock's removal, but the vote failed so spectacularly that even some of her usual supporters turned on her, arguing that if a driveway clock was the biggest threat Maplewood faced, maybe the HOA needed to rethink its priorities. Defeated but not finished, Carol vowed to escalate the matter to the county level, claiming that the clock might violate obscure zoning codes about non-standard pavement modifications. But before she could file the complaint, my neighbor's teenage son made a TikTok about the whole saga: the clock, the citations, the angry meetings, and within 48 hours the video exploded to over 300,000 views. Suddenly, the Maplewood clock was famous, and instead of just being a quirky neighborhood decoration, it became a destination with visitors from nearby towns stopping by to snap pictures and leave little notes in the unofficial guest book my wife placed next to the platform. The more Carol fumed, the more people came, and soon enough local news stations were calling for interviews, asking me to explain why a driveway clock had triggered a suburban revolution. I stood in my driveway, microphone in hand, trying to explain how I just wanted to brighten up my concrete, while in the background, Carol paced furiously in front of her house, waving her clipboard like she was trying to swat invisible flies. The clock, once just paint and metal, had become a symbol, not just of time but of time well spent, of neighbors laughing together, of a community deciding it liked joy more than rules, and by the end of that summer, it was clear that no fine, threat, or regulation could turn back the clock on what we had built together. As I stood there at sunset, watching kids play hopscotch on the numbers, couples posing for anniversary photos at the Time Traveler Station, and my neighbor's dog peacefully napping in the shade of the giant minute hand, I knew the clock was here to stay. Carol could fight it, scream about bylaws until her throat gave out, but the hands of the clock would keep turning, and with every hour that passed, it became more obvious that time was no longer on her side. Carol, humiliated by the failed vote and the neighborhood's overwhelming love for the clock, did exactly what everyone expected. She declared all-out legal war, treating my driveway like it was a hostile foreign embassy operating illegally on HOA soil. Within a week, I was served a thick envelope packed with official complaints filed not just with the HOA, but with the county zoning board, the building department, and even the regional historic preservation office because Carol, in her infinite creativity, decided that my clock might be altering Maplewood's historic suburban character. She accused me of illegally modifying hardscaping, violating community aesthetics, creating an unapproved public fixture, encouraging unauthorized public gatherings, and most bizarrely, operating an unlicensed timekeeping facility, which sounded more like a medieval guild violation than a real law. My lawyer, now so entertained by this circus that he had started keeping a scrapbook titled Carol's Greatest Hits, assured me that none of the complaints held any legal weight, but Carol's goal was never to win, it was to exhaust me into surrender. The problem for Carol was that I was not the only one fighting now. The clock had become the neighborhood's clock, and the moment word spread about the legal assault, my driveway filled with neighbors offering everything from legal advice to homemade cookies shaped like clock faces. The teenager next door, who had become the self-appointed timekeeper of Maplewood, launched a second viral TikTok explaining Carol's legal blitz, and within days the hashtag #SaveTheClock started trending locally, drawing attention from nearby towns and even a local news station eager for a quirky story. Reporters started showing up unannounced to film segments in my driveway, often catching Carol skulking around in the background, frantically photographing anyone who dared to touch the clock. The attention backfired spectacularly when a local radio station ran a segment called Carol vs. Time, featuring dramatic readings of her angriest emails, and a local brewery announced a limited edition IPA called Carol's Countdown, brewed in honor of her crusade against the clock. Meanwhile, the clock itself kept evolving, with neighbors adding personal touches. One artist painted tiny murals inside each number square, telling the story of Maplewood in 12 scenes, while another neighbor installed a small speaker that played the Westminster chimes every hour on the hour. Carol responded by filing noise complaints about the chimes, which only led to more publicity when the local paper ran a headline reading "HOA declares war on time itself." Every time Carol tried to shut the clock down, the neighborhood responded by making it even more beloved. One family built a miniature clock museum on their front porch, showcasing old photos and artifacts from the clock's construction, while another started hosting weekly chess games directly on the clock face, blending Maplewood's two greatest acts of rebellion into one unstoppable tradition. When the first court hearing arrived, the room was packed with neighbors wearing custom t-shirts featuring the clock's design, while Carol sat alone at the front of the room, glaring at anyone who smiled too much. Her lawyer argued that the clock was a dangerous precedent, a visual blight, and a threat to property values, but my lawyer countered with pages of letters from neighbors praising it, photos of community events that had formed around it, and even a petition signed by every resident except Carol herself demanding that the clock be officially protected. The judge, visibly tired of HOA nonsense after only 20 minutes, asked Carol to explain exactly how the clock had harmed her personally, and after a long pause she could only mutter that it bothered her greatly to see people treating a driveway like a tourist attraction. The judge dismissed most of her complaints on the spot, ruling that the HOA's authority did not extend to temporary paint and decorative elements on private driveways, especially when the community had so clearly embraced them. The ruling would have been victory enough, but the judge went a step further, suggesting that instead of removing the clock, the HOA should consider celebrating it as a community landmark, since it had clearly done more to bring the neighborhood together than any official HOA event ever had. Carol stormed out of the courtroom before the session even ended, leaving behind her binder of evidence, which included a hand-drawn timeline of my so-called violations, annotated with phrases like neighborhood collapse imminent and suburban decay timeline. The binder became an instant neighborhood artifact, displayed at the next block party like a museum piece, right next to a cake shaped like the clock, complete with edible chocolate clock hands. With Carol legally defanged, the clock's popularity exploded even further. Local schools started sending students on unofficial field trips to learn about the time that brought a neighborhood together, and a small production company began filming a documentary called The Driveway That Stopped Time, chronicling the entire saga from paintbrush to court victory. Carol, now fully outnumbered and outshined, retreated into her house like a defeated hermit, closing her blinds whenever visitors arrived to take photos, and refusing to answer the door when a reporter knocked to ask if she had any final words for the documentary. The clock had survived the first wave of war, but the battle had transformed it into something much bigger. It was no longer just a quirky driveway decoration, it was a symbol of what happens when neighbors choose creativity over conformity, laughter over fear, and shared joy over petty control. As I stood there after the ruling, watching kids race the minute hand and retirees sip coffee in lawn chairs beside the numbers, I realized Carol's greatest mistake was thinking time could be controlled with a clipboard and a citation. Time, like community spirit, was unstoppable, and as long as the clock kept turning, Maplewood belonged to the people who lived there, not the ones who wanted to rule it. Losing in court should have been Carol's signal to walk away with whatever dignity she had left, but instead, it flipped some kind of internal switch, turning her from a petty HOA president into a full-blown conspiracy theorist convinced my driveway clock was the first domino in the collapse of civilized suburban life. Within days of the ruling, Carol sent out a neighborhood-wide email titled Understanding the Psychological Impact of Driveway Disruptions, which read less like a community update and more like the ramblings of someone who had spent too much time in online forums about subliminal messaging and mind control. In her email, Carol claimed the constant visual presence of the clock was disrupting people's sense of time, causing stress, confusion, and what she called localized time dysmorphia, a term she almost certainly made up on the spot. Most people skimmed the email, laughed, and then printed copies to bring to the next block party, where it was read aloud dramatically by my neighbor's teenage son who had fully leaned into his role as Maplewood's unofficial timekeeper. But Carol was not content to just send emails. She escalated to real-world stunts, starting with placing a series of homemade warning signs along the sidewalk in front of my house, declaring that exposure to unauthorized timekeeping devices could lead to disorientation and temporal confusion. When those signs were mysteriously rearranged by local kids into a much funnier sentence about Carol being allergic to fun, she retaliated by filing another complaint, this time claiming the clock had become a magnet for unsanctioned vandalism and public hooliganism. Her obsession grew stranger by the day. She began taking hourly photos of the clock from her front yard, convinced the hands were being manipulated to send coded messages, and she even emailed the county claiming the clock was interfering with GPS signals in the area. That claim made it all the way to a local tech blog, which ran a piece titled "Does This Driveway Clock Control Time?", instantly turning my house into a pilgrimage site for bored tech enthusiasts and amateur paranormal investigators who wanted to see the so-called time-warp driveway for themselves. The more Carol fought the clock, the more people adored it, turning it into a living community art project where residents added their own creative touches. Seasonal decorations like Santa hats on the clock hands, a mini pumpkin patch for Halloween surrounding the numbers, and even a chalk art mural that turned the clock face into a giant pizza during the annual block party. Carol's frustration boiled over one morning when she staged a one-woman protest in front of my house, pacing back and forth holding a sign that read "Time Tyranny Ends Today," shouting at passing joggers about how unchecked driveway creativity would lead to moral collapse. The protest ended abruptly when my neighbor's dog, a golden retriever named Waffles, walked up, took the sign from her hand and trotted off with it, tail wagging, while the whole street erupted into laughter. Carol's sanity slipped further with each failed attempt to regain control. She filed noise complaints about the entirely silent clock, tried to claim the numbers created illegal reflective glare that endangered drivers, and even attempted to have the clock declared a religious symbol, arguing that its circular shape resembled some sort of forbidden time cult iconography. When none of that worked, Carol resorted to direct action, sneaking into my driveway at 3 a.m. wearing a headlamp and a pair of gardening gloves, caught on multiple security cameras trying to paint over the numbers with beige driveway sealant. She only managed to cover the number 12 before my motion lights kicked on, sending her fleeing down the street, leaving behind her bucket, roller, and a pair of monogrammed gardening gloves that immediately became the centerpiece of the next community potluck. The attempted vandalism backfired spectacularly, with the neighborhood rallying once again to repaint the clock bigger and brighter than before, adding bold colors and glow-in-the-dark accents so it would shine even at night. Carol's failure became folklore, retold at every neighborhood gathering, and immortalized in a new mural on my garage wall depicting a cartoon version of her fleeing from a glowing clock hand, pursued by Waffles with the stolen protest sign in his mouth. As word spread, the clock's fame transcended Maplewood entirely, appearing in local travel blogs, quirky roadside attraction lists, and even inspiring a short documentary titled The Woman Who Tried to Stop Time, which premiered at a regional film festival to standing ovations. Carol, realizing her reputation had transformed from neighborhood tyrant to local punchline, stopped leaving her house altogether, closing her blinds anytime someone paused to take a photo, and retreating fully into the digital world where she started posting long, incoherent rants on community message boards about the dangers of time-based installations. The clock, meanwhile, flourished, becoming the centerpiece of Maplewood life. It was where kids met to play, where families gathered for holiday photos, and where neighbors held impromptu picnics, all under the steady ticking of hands that now symbolized everything the community had fought to protect. What had started as a simple creative project had become a monument to shared defiance, a daily reminder that joy, creativity, and community could outlast even the most determined campaign of pettiness and control. As I stood in my driveway one evening watching a sunset reflect off the freshly painted numbers while a group of kids played tag around the clock face, I realized Carol had never stood a chance, because no matter how many rules she cited, how many complaints she filed, or how much beige paint she tried to pour over our fun, time itself was on our side. The clock was no longer just a driveway decoration, it was a beating heart, a gathering place, and a permanent reminder that in Maplewood, time belonged to the people who filled it with laughter, creativity, and life. After weeks of hiding behind her blinds, stewing in her own defeat, Carol emerged for what would become her final, desperate attempt to reclaim the neighborhood from the clutches of creativity, community, and that cursed driveway clock. She summoned the HOA for one last emergency meeting, announcing that the topic was the clock crisis and the future of Maplewood, a title so dramatic it sounded like a bad disaster movie. Despite her intention to rally the community back to her side, only 6 people showed up. 2 were her own relatives, 1 was her longtime hairdresser, and the other 3 were curious neighbors who came solely for the free coffee and to see what ridiculous scheme Carol had cooked up this time. With her audience reduced to a mere whisper of her former power, Carol delivered a 30-minute speech filled with apocalyptic warnings about property values crumbling, families fleeing in terror from unchecked driveway creativity, and Maplewood collapsing under the unbearable weight of its own whimsy. Her voice shook with desperation, but her words had lost all meaning to a community that had long since chosen laughter over fear, and by the time she unveiled her final plan, a proposed clock banishment amendment to the HOA charter, the only responses were a few stifled chuckles and one audible yawn. The vote to pass her amendment failed with a crushing 95% opposition, a level of rejection so severe it bordered on performance art, and the very next morning, Carol resigned from the HOA entirely, citing creative fatigue and irreconcilable differences with reality itself. That same afternoon, a spontaneous celebration broke out at the clock, with neighbors bringing folding chairs, snacks, and homemade signs reading "Long Live the Clock" and "Time Defeats Tyranny," while Carol's house sat dark and silent across the street. The clock itself was declared an official neighborhood landmark by unanimous vote at the next HOA meeting, now led by a new president who promised her entire campaign platform would be built around celebrating creativity instead of crushing it. Carol's name became neighborhood shorthand for unnecessary drama, and her entire reign was reduced to a cautionary tale told to new homeowners who asked why the clock was so important. The clock became more than just a symbol. It became a gathering place for every milestone, hosting birthday parties, retirement send-offs, Halloween costume parades, and even a surprise proposal where one couple spelled out "Will you marry me" in giant letters on the clock face itself. Local businesses embraced the legend, with the corner bakery selling timekeeper tarts and the coffee shop offering a weekly special called Carol's Last Cup, a bitter espresso with a side of sweet revenge. A group of retirees formed the Maplewood Time Club, meeting every week to play chess, sip wine, and reminisce about the time the neighborhood stood together against the clipboard queen. Even the local school started incorporating the clock into their history lessons, teaching kids about community activism through the story of how a simple driveway decoration became a symbol of unity and joy. Carol sold her house within weeks of resigning, disappearing from Maplewood entirely, though some say her listing price dropped specifically because of the clock's fame, which became its own kind of poetic justice. The new owners who moved in immediately embraced the legacy, hosting their own welcome party at the clock and promising to uphold its tradition for as long as they lived there. Over time, the clock grew even more elaborate, with new generations adding their own touches: solar-powered light displays for holidays, a rotating series of themed centerpieces, and even a neighborhood time capsule buried beneath the number 12, filled with photos, notes, and a laminated copy of Carol's very first violation notice. When the county's Cultural Preservation Committee visited Maplewood to officially recognize the clock as a historical community landmark, they left not just with paperwork, but with matching t-shirts that read Time 1. The clock became the heart of Maplewood's identity, the first stop on every community tour, the background of every family photo, and the final proof that creativity could outlast even the most stubborn attempts to crush it. Long after Carol faded into suburban myth, the clock kept ticking, a quiet and steady reminder that time, like joy, like community spirit, like good neighbors, was something no bylaw could control. Even as years passed, as families came and went, and as paint was refreshed and decorations changed, the story remained the same. Maplewood was the town that chose creativity over control, and the clock was the beating heart that proved it. And every time a new neighbor moved in and asked why the driveway had a giant clock painted on it, the older residents would smile, pull up a lawn chair and say, "Let me tell you about Carol, the queen who lost to time." Years after Carol's defeat and disappearance, the Maplewood clock had outgrown its humble origins, evolving from a neighborhood curiosity into something much bigger, a living monument to creative rebellion, community pride, and the simple joy of refusing to let your driveway be boring. What began as paint on concrete had become a cherished tradition, a place where birthdays were celebrated, first steps were recorded, and neighborhood kids marked their heights by standing next to the minute hand every New Year's Eve. New families moving to Maplewood learned about the clock within hours of unpacking, not from realtors or welcome packets, but from excited kids dragging them down the street to see the famous driveway where the neighborhood had once defeated the HOA queen herself. It became part of the town's identity, featured in tourism brochures, art walks, and even local folklore, with older residents swearing they could still hear the ghostly sound of Carol's furious flip-flops slapping the pavement if you stood quietly on the number 12 after midnight. Each year on the anniversary of the first-time games, the neighborhood gathered for a festival unlike anything the HOA ever could have imagined. A day-long celebration with games, food trucks, live music, and of course, the ceremonial reading of Carol's greatest citations, performed dramatically by a rotating cast of neighbors who treated her emails like Shakespearean monologues. The clock itself evolved over time, repainted annually with a new theme chosen by community vote, sometimes classic Roman numerals, sometimes psychedelic colors, and one year an elaborate steampunk design with fake gears painted onto the concrete. It was never just a decoration, it was a canvas, a storybook, a message to anyone passing by that this was a neighborhood where creativity thrived, where fun could never be fined out of existence, and where the only thing stronger than time was community spirit. Local artists donated new sculptures to the Time Traveler Station, turning the simple photo platform into a full-blown art installation, and visiting students from the nearby college wrote papers about the clock as a case study in grassroots community activism. The clock became a destination for everything from marriage proposals to graduation photos, and local businesses embraced the legend, offering clock-themed merchandise and naming menu items after famous moments in its history, like the Carol Crumble cookie and the Checkmate chai latte. Even though Carol had long since moved away, her name lived on in ways she never could have imagined, immortalized not as a ruler, but as a warning, a reminder of what happens when control becomes more important than community. New HOA presidents, terrified of becoming the next Carol, operated with a light touch, knowing full well that any attempt to rein in creativity would immediately be met with the question, do you really want to end up like her? The story spread far beyond Maplewood, inspiring neighborhoods across the country to embrace their own driveway rebellions, painting hopscotch boards, giant murals, mini soccer fields, and even a driveway-sized Ouija board that made national news after the neighborhood held a seance to summon the spirit of someone's long-lost pet ferret. Every one of those stories traced its inspiration back to Maplewood and its clock, a symbol that creativity, no matter how small or silly, could unify a community in ways no official committee or HOA handbook ever could. The clock taught everyone that rules only matter if they serve the people living under them, and that sometimes, the greatest act of defiance is simply choosing joy in the face of absurdity. Even after I eventually sold my house and moved across town, the new owners promised to maintain the clock and preserve its history, and every time I visited I saw that promise kept. The hands still turning, the paint still fresh, and the Time Traveler Station still standing proudly at the edge of the driveway. As years passed, the story became legend, blending truth and myth until no one was entirely sure which parts were real and which were exaggerated. Had Carol really tried to file a complaint with NASA claiming the clock was visible from space? Or was that just something the kids made up to make her sound even crazier? It didn't matter anymore because the spirit of the story was true. A driveway clock had once defeated an entire HOA regime, not because it was particularly powerful, but because it gave people something to rally around, something to love, something that reminded them why they lived here in the first place. In the end, the clock's greatest achievement was not defeating Carol, but transforming a street full of strangers into a community bound not by rules, but by stories, laughter, and the shared knowledge that time, like creativity, belongs to everyone. Long after the last person who remembered Carol personally has moved on, the clock will still be there, ticking away, reminding every new generation that Maplewood is a place where time belongs to the people, and joy always outruns the rules. And as long as the hands keep turning, so will the story, passed down like a treasure map, reminding everyone who moves to Maplewood that the most powerful thing you can ever build in your driveway is not concrete or brick, it's community.